barley in order to make more of the unedible stuff of the plant become part of the edible stuff, part of the fruit. And over several generations you could manipulate those plants, and then all of a sudden the fruity part, the humanly edible part, would be large enough that it could sustain a certain number of populations. Agriculture had been discovered. And with agriculture, of course, came settled humanity. We settled into villages prior to begin producing surpluses of that grain, which is in turn what gave rise to cities and what gave rise to central governments who could use that surplus of grain to now finance the division of labor. That is, not everybody now had to be a primary producer, not everybody had to be a farmer, not everybody had to be a peasant. There could be metallurgists, there could be soldiers, there could be a variety of other craftsmen who could be fed from that surplus of grain, and they could do, in turn, other productive work. So, but let's stay before the city and before urbanism and just stay with those villages. When the first agricultural villages appeared on the planet 10,000 years ago, in a period called the Neolithic, it is very hard to tell who domesticated whom. Well, humans domesticated plants because, of course, they took over the genetic apparatus in a very indirect way by controlled breeding and by controlling which plants pollinate which. But you could also say that plants domesticated humans because plants forced humans to take root. Plants forced humans to settle. And settling is not as if it was like a step in the ladder of progress, as if it was inherently better than being a hunter-gatherer. Hunter-gatherers have a much wider knowledge of the different nuts and berries, the different roots, the different kinds of edible materials all around them, and they, because of their much wider knowledge and their less dependence on a particular crop, they were much more resilient as human beings. Plus, there are problems that come with settling down, such as how do you handle refuse? How do you handle feces, human feces, for instance? When you're moving, as in a band of hunter-gatherers, you leave your feces, along the way. You never have to confront questions about epidemic diseases or infectious diseases that may be brought about by sanitation conditions. The moment you settle down into a village, you have to start thinking about your supply of water, and start thinking about the management of refuse. And of course, this may not have been an issue when you have a village of 100, 200 people, but it became an issue the moment you had cities with several thousand people. So settling down was not, as it were, a necessary step in the history of humanity. It was something that was adopted by some humans and then was imposed on some others when agriculture was exported from its original place in the Levant into Europe, for instance. But it was not necessarily something automatic and something that everybody accepted as better, as progress. In fact, we could say that, as I said, plants force us to take root. Plants, who of course are motionless living entities, forced us to become motionless. Another part of humanity, the part that eventually inhabited the central steppes of Europe, and many ethnic groups come from that area, not only the Mongols and the Huns, but also the Hittites and many others, domesticated not plants, but animals. They were pastoralists. And in particular, they domesticated the horse. The horse is, by nature, by instinct, a migratory species. They are continuously moving, as they move with the seasons, following the seasons across the great grasslands of the central steppes. And so the part of humanity that domesticated the horse had to become mobile, had to follow those herds of horses. And those were the ones who eventually became the nomads. These were not hunter-gatherers anymore, where civilized people, and existed in much larger numbers, except that they did not settle in the way in which agriculturalists did, or later on the urban peoples that followed them in Mesopotamia. They, for instance, did not create a mineralized exoskeleton of themselves, what we now call a city, a mineralized exoskeleton, which is your house, and the roads that communicate those houses to one another, and doors and windows and so on. They developed architecture that was foldable. They developed very interesting mode of tent-like architecture that you could unfold and settle down while the horses are settled in a particular part of the steppes, and they would have cities of several thousand people, foldable, movable cities. But nevertheless, the moment the horses started moving again, they would fold all their tents and move with the horses. And so that created a very different type of humanity. This doesn't really have anything to do with the subject matter of science today, except that Deleuze and Guattari take that point of divergence of humanity, when one part of humanity decided to take root, while the other part of humanity decided to keep on moving, because to them it exemplifies a distinction that can be applied in a whole variety of ways. Being sedentary, being territorialized, versus being nomad, being deterritorialized, that is, inhabiting a whole variety of territories, all of them identified by singularities, by singular things like an oasis or a particular point where you can get water and that serve as stops in an open-ended trajectory, versus settling down in a place in which now you have a very well-defined territory in which private property eventually could emerge and would begin subdividing that territory into now even more private territories. And Deleuze wants us to think about everything in those terms. Not necessarily the science that the Huns or the Mongols developed, although there is that. It's a military kind of knowledge. Remember that the Huns, the Mongols, the Hittites consistently defeated in battle sedentary armies, whether it's the sedentary armies of Egypt, the sedentary armies of Babylon, the sedentary armies of Europe, the sedentary armies of China. Throughout the ages and roughly up to the 1500s, in our own time, there was not a single battle that has ever won by sedentaries. Attila the Hun, for unknown reasons, failed to defeat the Roman army. And believe me, defeating the Roman army was already like a major deal, because the Roman army was perhaps the best army that sedentaries have ever had. He just refused. He just refused to take Rome. Nobody really knows why, but he could have, and history would have changed dramatically. So they did develop, if not a science, an art, the art of war. And it's an art of war that eventually was adopted by Western armies. Today's armies based on small platoons linked together by radio, and in which only the overall strategic objective is given by a general, and the tactical means of implementing that objective is decided at the platoon level, are basically nomad, are deterritorialized, just like the nomads used to be. But Deleuze wants to see there more than just that. He wants to see a divergence between what is territorialized and what is deterritorialized that can be applied in a whole variety of areas. And in particular, he sees that science itself, and this is why these remarks on science that I'm going to talk about are in that chapter, the chapter Nomadology, that science itself has some fields, or at least some persons in those fields, that would want to territorialize science. What is territorialized scientific knowledge? Well, it's an axiomatic. There's nothing more territorialized than an axiomatic. You have your 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 indubitable, doubtless, self-evident truths, and then a very simple mechanical procedure to produce more truths from those truths, and obviously in a pyramidal form with everything at the top, with the axioms on top, and kind of capturing in those axioms the final truth about everything. He wants to see a nomadic science, a science that, just like the nomads would follow their horses and would mark and would distinguish certain different areas of their land, not by the divisions made by territories, but by singular points like an oasis that serves as a stoppage point. So before you start moving again to another oasis or to another well or another source of water, and you move again from one singularity to another, he wants to see what other